welcome to a very special edition of The Piano Men with Stanley Carr. We have a special guest joining the program tonight. I am pleased to welcome singer-songwriter and pianist for the Grand Ole Opry band, Randy Hart, to The Piano Men this evening. Born in Washington, D.C., Hart got his start in the music business at 15 years old as a ticket seller for concerts, before joining a local band as a keyboard player and vocalist. Hart eventually moved to Los Angeles, where he got credits ranging from musical work on the film production of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the David Lynch cult classic Eraserhead, to performing background vocals on an Allman Brothers album. Following an 8-year run working with country music legend Roger Miller, Hart relocated to Nashville, where he worked with the likes of Steve Wariner, Gary Morris, and Garth Brooks, in addition to working for various publishing companies. After working for years as a staff pianist for the Grand Ole Opry, Hart was hired as a full-time pianist for the Opry band in 2014, where he continues to perform to this day. Welcome to the show, Randy.
Thanks, Stanley. I appreciate that. Thanks for having me. Couple of caveats in what you just said, which sounds pretty glorious, and it's not quite that glorious, but credits for Sgt. Pepper, I was not credited, but I was the pre-production audition pianist for all of the secondary parts. The movie didn't do quite as well as the producers thought it would do, which is a gross understatement. But there's a lot of people, there's probably more people that didn't see it than did, but it was, at the time, in the late 70s, in 77, it was one of these just bombastic Hollywood movies that had everybody and their brother and sister in it who was any name at all. And my role was for all of the secondary parts, because it starred Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees, and George Burns was in it as well. My role was for all of the secondary parts, for all of the people that were auditioning for those. They'd get 15 minutes with me to run over 2 songs from the album. I think it was Strawberry Fields and She's Leaving Home. There may have been another, but so I'd get the key for all those people. We'd go through the arrangement real quick, and then the producers would come in and audition them. So anyway, it's a self-imposed credit, I guess. I mean, I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm not in there, which I am in Eraserhead. I mentioned it as a thank you, I think, at the end of Eraserhead. And working with Steve Wariner and Roger Miller, yes. Played with Garth Brooks, yes. I didn't technically work for Garth. I mean, there was on multiple occasions when he would show up at different things that I would be doing with Steve most of the time, I guess it was. Anyway, just a little clarification on that, but for the sake of accuracy and not getting either one of us in a sling, I thought I'd cover that.
It's kind of cool how the entertainment business works, you know. So you grew up in Washington, D.C. Why don't you tell me about your upbringing?
I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, in the Northern Virginia town of Falls Church. And
I know where that is.
You do?
I do, because I actually grew up, spent a good part of my childhood up in Maryland, so I've driven through that area, so I'm very familiar with it.
Well, it's, I was there for my first 17, 18 years, I guess, and always played piano. I remember I was in early single digits walking up to a relative's piano, and I can't remember if it was Peter Gunn, or it could have been, I guess it wouldn't have been Pink Panther. That would have been after that. But anyway, I always played by ear, and I remember my parents surprising me one day. They said, "Come to the front door and look what's coming." And there was a moving truck with a Bradbury Spinet piano, and that was my first piano, and always played, took lessons for many years, and I took with wonderful teachers, particularly one teacher. His name was Charles Crowder, and he was the classical music reviewer, critic for the Washington Post. And he was a great pianist himself, of course. And so I took lessons with him for a few years until he realized that, I wasn't really made for playing classical music and learning that as much as he could offer. Because every time he'd walk out of the room, I'd bang out this week's top 40. So that's how I started selling tickets for a prominent concert promoter in the Washington area. He was, one of his claims to fame is the only time that Led Zeppelin and The Who were ever on the same bill was his concert. It was in May of 1969, and I was there, and it was something to remember, certainly. But I worked with that fellow who also managed a band that the shortcut version is I ended up joining, and we moved out to California together. They were much older than I, and had been in the Washington music scene for a number of years before I came along. And anyway, that's what happened.
And how old did you say you were when you received your first piano?
I'm guessing I was 5 or 6.
Wow.
Something like that. Yeah.
Do you remember like some of the first influences or artists that you grew up listening to? What made you want to pursue music?
I loved music, and getting more analytical than that, I don't really know what there is to it. I just always took to it. I loved it. Loved to play. Having already had that love and that passion, which I don't even know if you could call it a passion back in that era, but seeing professional musicians, my folks, particularly my mother, would take me to concerts of Ramsey Lewis and Peter Nero, and I was watching whatever the shows were, the variety shows, the entertainment shows that were on back in that era, the Tonight Shows and the Mike Douglases, and these are showing you my age, but wonderful musicians that I'd seen on that I just kind of paid attention to. So there was a bunch of them. There was a bunch of them that just made me realize how much I really enjoyed a variety of music genres.
And a lot of those shows, like you mentioned, the Tonight Show, I know Johnny Carson, right?
Right.
The Johnny Carson hosted Tonight Show. They had a lot of musicians come on there, and they got their big break on there. The Mike Douglas Show, as you mentioned, they had a lot of musicians get on there that were highlights from that era. And it really kind of, at that point, it was a big deal to get your music on one of those talk shows.
Absolutely. It was a big deal because that was back in that day, pre-cable, then that was true appointment viewing. Mm-hmm. And so the Mike Douglas Show was on in the, I think it aired in the mid to late afternoon. Tonight Show, which I ended up playing one time or a couple of times, one time with Roger Miller. And so for me to do that and for my relatives back on the East Coast who saw that was kind of, that was the validation. Okay, yeah, Randy, he's in show business.
He's made it.
He's made it, yeah. But it was wonderful. But yeah, you're right. There was great music, with the exception of certain specials, TV specials that would air. Those types of shows really were the best showcase for great musicians that, you wouldn't necessarily have heard of otherwise. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't, yeah.
So kind of backtrack a little bit. So you started playing keyboard and were a vocalist for a band at 17. Is that right? How did you get involved with that?
Well, that was the band that was managed by the concert promoter.
Mm-hmm.
His name was Les Grossman, and he had an office on M Street in Georgetown, right across from a very prominent venue called the Cellar Door. And so I would take a bus down to, I got bitten from show business at an early age, or the entertainment business, because I just wanted to be a sponge and absorb it all. And here I was able to work, even though it was sweeping floors and answering the phone occasionally when the secretary had to leave her desk, for working for somebody that was really in the business. I mean, big concerts. Steve Miller Band, the ones I mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
The Who, Led Zeppelin, Janis Joplin, Frank Zappa, Joe Cocker. I mean, these were the top acts of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they're all iconic now. They've become people that everyone recognizes from all ages. So I worked for him. He had a band that he managed that I just through osmosis would meet, and I even booked them to a couple of local, like, high school dances or whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And on one of those, there was a piano backstage, and because I was familiar with their songs, I walked up to the piano and just started playing. And they didn't know I could play until then. They had lost the organ player that they had, who again was their age range, and here I was, this kid playing their songs. So they asked me, "Hey, do you want to come play and do some jobs?" And away I went.
And I believe you guys moved to Los Angeles, and that's when you started scoring films, scoring music for different films. Tell me about for those that don't know about film scoring, what goes into that experience? Tell me about what's film scoring like.
Well, I wouldn't call myself by any means a film scorer. I was involved and asked to play, and this is a great example of, if you have the right equipment, you can usually get a job. Mm-hmm. There was a film. We were playing. The band was playing at a venue in Hermosa Beach, California, not far from where we lived. We lived in the Hollywood Hills in Laurel Canyon, actually, which a lot of people are familiar with. And I had a Mellotron. I got a Mellotron back probably, well, I moved out to California with it, so it was probably in the early mid-'70s that I got this. And someone came into the club that I was playing in, and there's I used to call it an ice box because it was a big white melamine structure, a big thing. But boy, if you had a Mellotron, you were really, you had at that time the choice piece of gear. And this guy came in. He was doing a soundtrack for an independent movie called Gone in 60 Seconds. There's actually two versions of Gone in 60 Seconds. One is the one that this fellow produced, and then years later, I think it was Nicolas Cage and somebody else, they redid it in, with stars and with a lot higher production values. But so I played on that. He had me bring my icebox down to where he lived on the beach and do some tracks for that. Eraserhead was a similar situation. I had known David Lynch from when I lived in the East Coast.
Wow.
The band I was working with, a couple of the guys went to school with David, and they were recording in Philadelphia for producers named Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, who were going to sign this band. And so somehow I ended up going to Philly, and met David there. And when I moved out to Los Angeles, David had moved out there as well. And he called, and Eraserhead was a movie that was filmed and produced over a period of 5 years. And it was very much hand-to-mouth funding. And so David would call some friends and say, hey, can you help me out? I want to get some raw stock or something like that. I need to get something developed, whatever it may be. And so I'd go down to David's and meet him, and be able to give him some a little bit of money. And one time he called and he said, hey, can you create a love theme for me? I need a love theme. He didn't tell me a whole lot. And here I am in my early 20s, and I thought, well, sure, I can do that. What do you need? Love theme, done. So he said, I'll come over and bring my audio guy, Alan Splett. And so they came over, and I was turning on my organ in the garage where my band would rehearse, and all ready to play my whatever love theme I had written. And he heard my Leslie going, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. He said, "Ooh, what's that?" I said, "Oh, that's just the speaker warming up." And he said, "Alan, record that." So he did that. Then I turned it on the fast speed. That's great. Then I held down a note on the organ, and one by one, he had me pull out the stops. And all of those sounds were incorporated into his movie Eraserhead. And, my theme, I don't think I even played it that day. That got washed by the wayside. But anyway, that's pretty much it. I hope I answered your question. I went down a real rabbit hole.
That's pretty incredible, that you got to meet him and work with him. David Lynch is like one of the most world-renowned filmmakers in the whole industry. I mean, that's pretty cool.
It was great. And David, if you're familiar with his films, and I frankly, I have a hard time watching his films because they're very disturbing, and they're intended to be very disturbing and very thought-provoking, on some dark levels. But David and I we'd meet up at his bungalow in Beverly Hills, and we'd go down to Farmer's Market, or we'd go to Barney's Beanery. These are places that are well known in the Hollywood area, and get coffee. We drank a lot of coffee and get a piece of pie, and we'd talk about it. And talking to David is like talking to, if you're familiar with Jimmy Stewart, who was starred in It's a Wonderful Life.
Great actor.
Great actor. Very down to earth, very sane, very linear type guy. That's how David was. He'd say, well, it's kind of weird. He wouldn't let me come down to the set to watch Eraserhead be filmed. But I said, no, you stay away. So I had no idea what I was kind of putting this money in. Went to see the premiere, and I walked out of there I had my girlfriend with me, and I said, I have no idea what that movie's about. I just, whatever money I've put in, it's gone. Well, that was obviously not the case.
So you later got your big break working for the legendary Roger Miller. Do you remember the first time you guys met, and what was it like working with him?
Yes, I do remember the first time we met. I had moved because of the Sgt. Pepper movie. I had made enough money to buy a home in an area that I really liked and was familiar with. And it was as close as I could get to Los Angeles as I could afford. It was a mountain resort area called Lake Arrowhead. And I had moved into Lake Arrowhead right after Sgt. Pepper. My job was done. It was, I moved into an A-frame that didn't have any kind of heat other than the wall heat. Well, it's at a high elevation, and in the wintertime, it gets pretty cold up there. And I got a call in January from a friend who said, "Hey, do you want to come audition for Roger Miller?" He was Roger's guitar player, band leader at the time. I said, "Yeah, of course." So I went down and auditioned for Roger and his wife Mary at their home in Beverly Hills, and ended up, getting the job from that point. That band leader left shortly thereafter, and I kind of assimilated into that role for the next 8 years. It was wonderful, wonderful time.
That's a wonderful story.
Taught me a lot.
We're going to transition here to this selection called See Through Me. Tell me about the recording and the making of the song and who played on it. Tell me about See Through Me.
This See Through Me was a song that the band called Tractor that I worked with. And again, these are guys that had Washington, D.C. music creds that went way back, way before me, and before I came along. And the guitar player, Ron Culbertson, wrote the song. And it was right at the time that Carole King was really starting to emerge with her album Tapestry. A lot of people knew Carole from her songs that she had written, but not as an artist really before then. And so they wanted a treatment somewhat in a Carole King-ish vibe. And of course it had piano on it. And having no idea of what I was doing, it was the first time I had been in a recording studio with these guys. And so, that was Don't Try to See Through Me. Yeah.
Well, we're going to play See Through Me. This is See Through Me on The Piano Men. You're tuned to The Piano Men with Stanley Carr. I'm chatting with singer-songwriter and pianist Randy Hart tonight about his illustrious career in the music industry. So you later moved to Nashville and began working with, at the time, rising country artist Steve Wariner. Eventually, 2 of the songs that you submitted got selected as #1 hits from one of Wariner's albums. Tell me about your time working with Steve.
I joined Steve in 1986, just a few months before my daughter was born. Having moved out here to become a studio musician, which didn't happen in the first week, so I thought, well, this isn't going to work. So I started looking for or not really looking, but I was contacted to see if I'd be interested in playing with Steve. Well, I wasn't quite sure who he was, but then when I listened to his material that I was going to be auditioning with, I thought, oh, sure, I've heard of that song, this song, a number of songs that he had by that time. And I joined Steve as a piano player and sang background vocals as well. And at some point, a friend of mine who I had known from California and actually done some album recording with in California, Bill LaBounty, and his wife had written a song called The Weekend. And Bill sent me the demo just so I could hear it because I loved everything Bill did. We were close friends, and I was pretty tuned in to his material and what he was doing. And I thought at the time, because Steve was working on an album, I thought, this sounds like something that Steve may want to hear. And so I get on the bus, and Steve tells this story to this day. He had listened to 1,000 songs that day. He was in prep mode for the next album. And he graciously took the cassette and popped it in, knowing that he was just, brain dead from having listened to all these songs that day. And it didn't take long for him to stop the bus and call Tony Brown and say, we got to put this on hold. And it's called The Weekend. It became a very signature career song for him.
We're actually going to play that song in a little while, but I'd imagine that going through songs like that, it's kind of hard at times to find out what kind of song would fit for an artist if you're writing for an artist.
Well, this wasn't necessarily written, this was not written for Steve, but it was stylistically, Steve was not a traditional, certainly a hat type act, male country singer. His style and what he had done and the direction that this album was pointed in was in, more of a popish country direction. It wasn't just, a straight like Merle Haggard type country music. It was in a different direction, kind of taken from Merle that, Steve can and does sing traditional country music, but his real hits are of a different ilk. So it just seemed like it was a good fit for from what I had known being around Steve and the project, what he would be looking for.
So when working on an album, from your perspective, how does the songwriting process work? When do you know if a song sounds good to become a hit single?
Well, I'm not primarily a songwriter. I've gotten lucky on a couple of things, but I don't think you ever really know. You know if something's good, I think, and sometimes you think things are good that aren't, and sometimes you don't. You think that things aren't good that are, that people react to. And this is just from my experiences of being around, umpteen artists over the years that I've seen that happen to on both sides of that. You know if something is technically right. Does this have the right chords? Is it saying what it needs to say lyrically? Because I was in music publishing for a few years, and I got lucky in that regard as well. It's just kind of the stars line up, and whether you're a songwriter or a music publisher, if you get a hit, it's like a big a board game, what do they call it, pachinko, where the little ball comes down, and you never know where that ball is going to land. But if you're lucky, then you get the jackpot once in a while.
So, I'm going to throw out some names. You've worked with a lot of people over the course of your career. I'm going to throw out some other names of some people you've worked with, and if you can, describe them in a few words. We're going to start with the Allman Brothers.
Allman Brothers, my connection with them, I never met them, never was in the studio. I was in Los Angeles. They had recorded in, I guess it was either Georgia or it may have been New York, but they needed background vocals. This was a time when Greg Allman had left, and this was their album called Brothers of the Road. And somehow, I forget exactly who it was, I got a call from a friend of mine that knew that I could sing and say, hey, do you want to put some background vocals on this Allman Brothers album? I said, sure. So I went down and did that. They had to overnight it. That's what you did in those days. Back to Clive Davis, who was the big Columbia Records. Well, yeah, at this time it was Arista. He was with Arista, and the Allman Brothers this was an Arista project. And so anyway, I ended up, I can say legitimately that I sang on an Allman Brothers album. Never met him. Actually, I think Greg came into a club I was in one night, but I don't think I ever had the opportunity to say, hey, I'm on one of your, well, it wasn't his record anyway. It's
pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
And you also worked with Gary Morris, Broadway actor. Tell me about working with him.
Gary had a number of big country, again, not in the traditional country style, similar to Steve in that regard. And I had pitched those two records, those two songs to Steve, which did very well, The Weekend and Linda. And a mutual friend of Gary's and myself who managed Gary said, he's thinking about wanting to staff up his music publishing company. And would you be interested? And I wanted to get off the road anyway. I had an infant daughter and a younger son. And I said, yeah, I'd love to talk about that. So I ended up, it was a 3-person office. It was me pitching the songs. It was Gary, who was doing, he was involved in all kinds of things. That's shortly before he went on Broadway to play Jean Valjean in Les Mis. And Faith Hill. Faith answered the phone.
Wow.
And so that was the 3-person office. We had, 3, 4, 5 writers, one of which was Victoria Shaw, who had already been writing with Garth Brooks. She had befriended Garth. Garth was just a newbie in town at that point. And she had written a song called The River. And The River ended up being one of Garth's, big hit songs. And so Gary did very well from that as a music publisher. And I, even though I had absolutely nothing to do with it, except calling Victoria one day that Garth had cut it. I had absolutely nothing to do with the song, but the company was the company's name was there, and I was with the company. So.
And last but not least, Chet Atkins.
Chet, I only knew through Steve Wariner, and I met him through Steve Wariner when Steve and I had written a song called Hold On a Little Longer. And we went to the BMI Awards. Then Steve was seated at, and I were seated at Chet and his wife Leona's table. Chet was really the main significant part of Steve's musical history. Having signed him and worked with him, Steve was his protege. So my connection with Chet came when Steve, creative connection, if you will, came when Steve was recording his album, a tribute to Chet. And he did a medley of all of Chet's songs that people didn't realize necessarily that he produced. He was a phenomenal producer, very successful producer. And so we recorded a medley of those songs, and that medley ended up winning a Grammy.
And we're going to play that song right now. This is the Producer's Medley on the Piano Men. And we're back on the Piano Men talking with singer-songwriter pianist Randy Hart. Tell me, what made you decide to move to Nashville?
I had been working with Roger Miller for 8 years, and Roger did not work extensively on the road, but he would work, when he performed. It would be, at that time, it was the casino centers were Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and Reno, and Lake Tahoe. Mm-hmm. And those were the primary centers where we would play. Now, he would do fairs from time to time, but I think he preferred playing in casinos because he could get in, settle in, be there for a week or 2 weeks, whatever it would be. Roger had written a play called Big River, written the music for a play. And Big River, the success of that, it won 5 Tony Awards in 1985. And the success of that, to me, the writing was kind of on the wall that Roger didn't like to work a whole lot on the road anyway. Well, this was even going to probably knock that down a notch or two because of the success that the play was having. So I decided to move to Nashville. I was familiar with Nashville. I had been here on a couple of occasions working with, I worked with a comedian named Gary Muledeer. And Gary, actually, I met Gary because he was an opening act for Roger in Las Vegas. So I had come here and performed at the Zanies Comedy Club and went around the country. And when Roger wasn't working, it was kind of understood that when Gary would go out and work, if Roger was working, that was my priority responsibility. And when he wasn't, then I had the ability to go work with him. So moved to Nashville because I thought it was just a logical place for me to be and my family, raise our kids, and it made more sense than Southern California did at the time.
So now, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, you are the keyboard player for the Grand Ole Opry Band. Tell me how you first got involved with the Opry.
It was through Steve Wariner, through playing with Steve. This was back in right around, I guess you can say turn of the century. That sounds pretty, turn of the millennium.
2000.
2000. And so I had played with Steve. The music director at the time was, his name was Steve Gibson, and Steve was a very prominent studio player here in Nashville. Wonderful, wonderful musician, great guitar player. And I knew Steve just from, being around in this area. And the time came for a substitute position had come up. The fellow who was playing there, who had the job at the time, Tim Atwood, would take vacations from time to time. They needed somebody to come in and sub. So I became the sub for a number of years, and then ultimately was able to land that job, which is just a dream come true.
And the most fascinating, what I think is one of the most fascinating parts of being a part of such a unique ensemble is that whenever I hear the Opry broadcast live, the announcer will say that when they introduce the band, that the band rehearses with the artist one time, and then they go on and perform. Do you feel that there's any pressure when you only have such a limited amount of time to run through each song with the performers?
Well, that's not to indicate that would be the first time that we would hear the songs or work on the songs. We will have received the material, and we'll have received a chart that we can kind of cross-reference when we listen to the song and maybe make our own notes. And depending upon what the song is and how complex it may be with any given instrument, if it's your instrument, then obviously you have to take a little longer and spend some time with it. But yes, ultimately the artist will come in just shortly before we walk on stage, and we'll go over it just to make sure the chart works and everything's sounding the way it's supposed to and feels the way it's supposed to. And then we'll walk on stage and do it. And it is pretty daunting to do that.
Tell me, Randy, what is the most fun about being a part of the Opry Band?
There's a lot of things. It can be the people, the performers that you know and love, you get to play with. It can be the performers that you don't know, that just really, you take notice of because of how strong they are, how good they are. No two shows are alike stylistically. We can play everything from What the World Needs Now is Love with Dionne Warwick to The Bottle Let Me Down. It's all over the map, and it's just fascinating to do that with a group of musicians that have the ability to kind of bob and weave through all these different genres and pull it off.
And a lot of people have come through there. You've got Luke Combs, you have Josh Turner recently played there. You have Marty Stewart that recently played there. Tell me, any cool stories you want to share about some of the people you've shared the Opry stage with?
Well, I can think of Luke Combs, and I can think of now Carly Pierce and Chris Jansen. Forgive me if there are others that I had played with, but those that I had played with in the same capacity that I'm about to explain, seeing those artists come to the Opry for the first time, or in very, very early parts of their career, and just propel like they did and explode like Luke has and like Chris has, and Carly is having that happen as well. That is fascinating to see that happen. And then the flip side of that is seeing artists that have been there, the Bill Andersons and the Connie Smiths and the Jeannie Seeleys, who have been there for 50, 60 years, and
decades.
Still, for decades, in success in all of those decades, and still get up there and really, bring their A game, and they're great. Plus that's a piece of the history pie that you don't get from a whole lot of people. So it's wonderful to work with them.
And there's definitely nothing like performing on that Opry stage. So you're playing at the Grand Ole Opry. What's next for you?
I'm going to take a nap. No, although that's probably not far from the case. My whole career has been unplanned. It's been a situation of just connecting the dots that were in my toy box, and the Bill LaBounties and the Steve Wariners and the Roger Millers and the Gary Muledeers and all of the people that I've worked with. It was, invariably in some way, shape, or form, one thing would lead to another, and I'm where I am now. And I dare say not a night goes by when I don't look out at that auditorium at the Opry and think, how in the hell did this happen? I'm very grateful, but I don't have the answer for that.
How would you like to be remembered?
Gosh, I've never been asked that. He was a good guy, and he could play piano pretty well. And he was a good father. That's probably, those three things like that would mean the most.
Are your kids learning music? You just mentioned your dad.
Well, they're grown and gone. They both love music. My daughter is a little more musical oriented than my son, but again, their love for music is undeniable, and they grew up with everything that I was having to learn or play or listen to or whatever. So they got a pretty good taste of a lot of different things from an early age. Yeah.
They're getting a great education, musical education.
Well, yeah, they heard a lot, and then they developed their own tastes, which is wonderful. But they still have a remembrance of what they grew up with.
So let me ask you, through all the stuff that you've been through and done over the course of your career, what advice would you give to someone that wants to go into the music business, whether it's as a songwriter, singer, music publisher? What advice would you give somebody that wants to enter the music business?
Well, I guess first and foremost is perseverance and surviving the ups and downs for me was a big part of being able to stay involved as long as I have. And I, having gone back to when I was with that concert promoter in the early 70s, that makes it 50 years that I've been 50 plus years that I've been doing this. And a lot I can attribute to just staying in it. And I see that now with younger artists and younger musicians that have, you're in it long enough, and depending upon what I talk about connecting the dots, your own little circle of contacts is, and how one thing can lead to another. Don't lose sight of that. And if it's really a part of your passion, then just don't give up.
Absolutely. That perseverance is very important.
Absolutely it is. And I'll bet, I know you're in an early phase of your broadcasting career, and I can tell you're passionate about what you do.
Thank you.
And you do your homework. That's another big important. Show up, be on time, and do the prep work you need to do, whether it's playing live with somebody, learning a song that you've got to record, whatever it may be. Do the work. Take it seriously, but have fun.
Always. So where can people find more of your work? Do you have a website, any social media? Where can people find more about you?
I don't have a website, and it's kind of scattered all over, so it's just going to be hit and miss. I guess if you Google me, then you'll see odds and ends that are coming up, and it's just hard to say because I've never pursued that or really looked at marketing myself. I don't have those things, so good luck.
Well, Randy, we can go on and on and talk more about the music business and adventures in the music business, but unfortunately we are out of time. But I wanted to thank you very much for coming on the show. It means a lot, and I want to invite you to come back on again soon sometime.
That's great. Maybe I can bring some friends, and we can tell some more stories that people may find entertaining and or informative. But I appreciate the opportunity to come here. Thanks a lot, Stanley. You did a great interview.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Well, we're going to close with The Weekend, a song that was a huge hit for Steve Wariner. And that's going to do it for this week here on The Piano Men with Stanley Carr. Like us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/The Piano Men Radio Show. I will see you next week.